We're back. Thank you for joining us after our hiatus. I am Shoshana Bryan, Senior Director of the Jewish Policy Center, and your host. Today, I have to say I'm very excited to have Dr. Evan Ellis of the U.S. Army War College as our guest. Those of you who read inFOCUS, which should be all of you, know his work. But now I get to sit with him and talk to him about a hemispheric event that has repercussions in North, Central, and South America, the Middle East, from Israel north to Syria and Lebanon and across the region to Iran. This is big, even though it happened right here. The arrest of Nicolás Maduro is possibly the most consequential American act in South America since John Kerry gave up the Monroe Doctrine in 2013. The Monroe Doctrine of 1823 expressed American opposition to new European dependencies anywhere in the Americas. At no time, however, did it mean that we don't care what happens in the region. It is our neighbor. It's important to us. But by 2013, many people thought it was irrelevant. The Soviet Union, after all, was gone. But since then, activities by Iran, China, and Russia belie that thought. Israel's issues regarding illegal immigration, drugs, money laundering, guns, sex and labor trafficking, and more are on our plate as well as on the plate of our southern neighbors. Venezuela under Maduro and his predecessor, Hugo Chavez, were in the middle of all that. So, a quick introduction to the JPC, and then on to Dr. Evan Ellis. The JPC was established in 1985. You can find us on our website at jewishpolicycenter.org. There you can see our insight articles and our magazine inFOCUS Quarterly. The winter issue went up last week. We have started America's 250th birthday. Take a look at our newly revamped In Context section as well. You can find all of this and webinars from the past at jewishpolicycenter.org. The JPC supports a strong American defense capability, U.S.-Israel security cooperation, and missile defense. As it has been since October 7th, 2023, our most important job is to support the government of Israel and the IDF in their defense of the people and the borders of Israel, inside the borders and outside the borders, ensuring that Hamas has neither military nor governing capability, and securing the release of the remaining hostage, Ron Gvili. Don't forget, there is still a hostage. We also support American support for Israel. And domestically, we have an agenda as well. Small government, low taxes, free trade, fiscal responsibility, energy security, free speech, and intellectual diversity. And now we're going to go to our speaker. Dr. Evan Ellis is Latin American Research Professor and General Douglas MacArthur Research Chair at the U.S. Army War College Strategic Studies Institute. If you can say that without stopping, you're a better man than I am. His focus is on the region's relationships with China and other non-Western hemispheric actors, as well as transnational organized crime and populism in the region. He previously served on the Secretary of State's policy planning staff with responsibility for Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as on the international narcotics and law enforcement issues. In his academic capacity, Dr. Ellis has presented his works to a broad range of businesses and several times before Congress. Apparently, he's done this in 27 countries, so I think I'm really excited that he's doing it here for us. And he appears in inFOCUS Quarterly. He has published more than 600 works, including 5 books. Those are mostly China-oriented, which is not our focus today, but you can be assured that if you read them, you will know more and you will worry more. Dr. Ellis has been awarded the Order of Military Merit Jose Maria Cordova by the Colombian government and an honorary professorship at San Martin de Porres University of Peru for his scholarship on security issues in the region. And that's where we're tapping in today. And so now I bring you Dr. Evan Ellis. And Evan, the floor is yours.
Shoshana, thank you very much. For me, it's a real honor to be able to share my thoughts with this group and work with the Jewish Policy Center, and of course to see and interact with you here in person, albeit virtually in this program. I wanted to emphasize that although I am currently a civilian employee of the U.S. government at the War College, the views that I'm going to express today are strictly my own in an academic capacity, and to that extent, I'll be happy to speak very, very frankly about what's going on in Venezuela. Let me begin by giving some thoughts about the military piece and then some of the challenges going forward. Obviously, with respect to the military operation in the broader context of President Trump's policies to push back against Venezuela as a source of narco trafficking and other threats, and some of the things that led up to that, the enormous U.S. Military deployment in the Caribbean, the counter drug operations, and various other activities. But I think one has to say that the operation to capture Nicolás Maduro really reflected first enormous intelligence capability, which probably begun with President Trump's public authorization of CIA work as well as others, again, with people who probably found a relatively cooperative group of people on the ground in Venezuela, people who are in all walks of life, alienated from the criminality as well as the economic disaster that has been the Maduro government, and really going all the way back to Hugo Chavez. But beyond the importance of the what I would call intelligence preparation and coordination that had to play out over a course of at least 2 months, if not more, but also you had, of course, the substantial planning, the rehearsal. To me, the simultaneity of the operation in being able to have effects in different domains, so involving information warfare, cyber warfare activities, electronic warfare, and the suppression of enemy defenses, different essentially spoofing operations to direct Venezuela's attention at other places, plus a number of different very carefully coordinated kinetic activities. My understanding is that you had at least 140 aircraft from at least 10, if not more, launch points from throughout the Caribbean and elsewhere. And so it was really an impressive operation, especially when you get down to those final couple minutes and realize that despite the fact that essentially this was to grab Nicolás Maduro in Forteuna, which just south of Caracas is one of the most heavily defended and one of the principal military installations that the Venezuelans have. And so to go in right into the center of that, right at the last minute, to disable all of the key last tier air defenses, come in with helicopters without any losses or otherwise, and literally within probably about 3 minutes to get into the facility where Maduro was, so quickly that he didn't even have time to get to his essentially steel vault safe room to be able to grab both of them alive without losing any equipment or any U.S. fatalities, although there were injuries, and then get him out. I think, it demonstrated a remarkable combination of intelligence, planning, rehearsal, coordination, and U.S. capabilities that I think more broadly, whether it's the Iranian regime looking at President Trump's threatened response there as they kill and otherwise repress protesters, or others elsewhere in the world, such as China, are looking at this, at least understanding that the U.S. has oftentimes surprising capabilities and the ability to use them. So that's the good part. Clearly, we demonstrated capability, which I would argue gives us extraordinary leverage with the people that remain. Not only do we continue to physically have those demonstrated military capabilities in the area and have shown that literally we were able to, basically tear through the, Russian air defenses and the Chinese radars and the other systems and the inner perimeter of Cuban security forces, of which at least 32 Cubans, as I understand, in that internal security detail were eliminated. But again, with the implication that the U.S. can do this or similar things. Again, you put that on top of the considerable power that the U.S. has shown through targeted sanctions, through the enforcement of blockades against at least 5 different Russian, Chinese, and other oil tankers operating in the shadow fleet, and of course the presumption that Maduro is probably cooperating with U.S. law enforcement, meaning that in addition to all the other people who've cooperated, that Jorge and Delcy Rodriguez, Vladimir Perino Lopez, Diosdado Cabello, the rest of Chavismo leadership probably understand that essentially their secret bank accounts, the nature of their criminal schemes, and the legal liability associated with it pretty much exposes them. And so I think on the one hand, we have a lot of leverage, but what I would argue is that does not necessarily give us what at least has been, formally, indicated as, controlling or running Venezuela. I think we are in a situation of what I would call a coercive diplomacy, in which clearly the Trump administration and Delcy Rodriguez and others have certain interests. A couple key points for me. Number one, this continues to be the same group of people that has committed human rights violations, that has committed a number of war crimes, that has operated a franchise criminal operation that includes not just narco trafficking, but also illegal mining and extortion and kidnapping and a variety of other activities that has long worked to destabilize neighboring democratic governments, that has worked against U.S. interests, that has expropriated oil and other industries, has defaulted on loans. This is the same group of bad actors, even if you take away essentially the figurehead that was Nicolás Maduro. Beyond that, however, it's interesting. The deal that you see with the United States right now is arguably something that Nicolás Maduro would have dreamed to have gotten. In other words, the idea that just to turn over some of the oil to the United States and let the U.S. Take a cut. If you do certain things that the gringos want, maybe throw the Iranians and the Russians and the Cubans to a certain degree under the bus. You have the prospect of getting your economy opened up, out from under international sanctions, maybe out from under legal jeopardy, and even what President Trump has promised to essentially suspend the enforcement of legal cases against a number of the different Venezuelan organizations who defaulted on loans. In other words, Delcy Rodriguez has a lot of incentives to try to cooperate. Having said that, however, there are divisions within the organization and fears that some of those pieces are being thrown under the bus. Certainly the ELN, who has operated with impunity on Venezuelan territory and illegal mining. Now that Delcy Rodriguez has talked about working with the United States to go after the ELN, that gives them incentives to push back. There are rumors that others with slightly different areas of the criminal operations, Pedrino Lopez or Diosdado Cabello, may be angling to try to undercut Delcy if she goes too far or doesn't give sufficient protection to their interests. So I think there's a very delicate process of negotiation. And then finally, what I would say is in terms of where this seems to be going in the future, Marco Rubio has indicated that this is following a three-pronged plan that starts with stabilization and then goes to basically recovery or development and then to political transition. Now, clearly the Trump administration made a cold calculation that may or may not have paid off, which is not going to the democratically elected government of Edmundo Gonzalez, who was clearly elected on July 28th, 2024, and instead going with Delcy Rodriguez prevents the Chavistas from seeing their interests being threatened and thus prevents them from launching a promised campaign of sabotage against the oil and other sectors. And so we have bought stability at the price of not bringing back Democrats and indeed basically keeping in the same group of bad actors. We are obviously now working towards this development with the U.S., at least in terms of embargoed oil taking delivery. My sense is that you will see some initial reactivation, but it will have limits. And so Chevron has the general license. My understanding is that they had to do something with the embargoed oil, or else they'd have to shut down their production complexes. And so, that 50 million barrels of oil, that's being allowed, transferred through Chevron to the U.S. essentially allows them to keep pumping oil so that they don't have to shut down. There's been some talk that Chevron may take certain other operations to be ratcheted up. Some of the petroleum service companies like Halliburton and Schlumberger may get back into the game, some in the gas sector, some related activities in the broader Caribbean, for example, maybe the Dragon Field, of which Shell has an interest in Trinidad and Tobago. But my sense is that as the CEO of Exxon, who called Venezuela uninvestable right now, before serious companies put real money in, the $100 billion that's been talked about, there are a number of things that just isn't there. So there's not juridical security. There is not the elimination of sanctions that you need. Frankly, there's not clear political authority. Who are they signing deals with? I would point out that, for example, the U.S. has at least formally not recognized Nicolás Maduro as president since the expiration of his term in 2019, which means by extension that the default to his named vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, technically does not have, at least in the U.S. opinion, legal authority to sign new oil contracts. Now, I suspect that we'll probably try to work around that, but the juridical institutions able to enforce contracts, there is not the capacity or the objectivity that an oil company like Exxon would need. And frankly, the oil infrastructure itself is just an absolute mess from an environmental, from a safety standpoint, from a economic standpoint. The mixing stations, the refineries, the transfer points, the storage facilities. And so my sense is you'll get some ramp up in economic activity. I mean, American Airlines has announced they're coming back. Some other companies are reopening activities, but I think the serious money is always coming. And then the final question is, when do you get to that phase three, or do you get to that phase three? Today, Thursday, Maria Corina Machado is actually meeting with President Trump. The question, President Trump has indicated that she did not have the confidence of the right Venezuelan people, in his words, necessary for him to support, her immediate presidency. But at what point do you get to new elections or other things that really gives the Venezuelan people the sense that there is a new country, that it is, their own democratic representatives, that you get rid of this criminal group that for 20 years has been taking advantage of the country. So I think that third piece about a democratic transition is going to be key for the real political, economic resurrection and the return of the more than 9 million Venezuelans throughout the world. So some of my just overall thoughts about the very complex situation that we're in, and look forward to taking the conversation forward with you.
Thank you. That's it's a very nice, concise way to look at things. Let me start with, I spend more time looking at the Middle East, and I look at Iran, and I wonder what's going to happen if the mullahs are suddenly deposed, and then what? So it seems to me that President Trump and his advisors made a good choice to keep the establishment in Venezuela there. Yes, it's got problems, and no, it's not people that I want to have over for dinner, but it does seem to me that it keeps chaos from erupting. I can't see if Reza Pahlavi took over in Tehran today, I'm not sure that the army would agree with that, or the Basiji Guard would agree with that. At least in Venezuela, it seems to me. They're going to accept that this is the way life is. So you have the same players, as you say, but under different circumstances. It was a good move, wasn't it?
I think there's certainly a case to be made for that. To me, there's a whole range of options. It wasn't necessarily just the one or the other, but I think you're absolutely correct that there's an understanding that getting from a military whose generals were loyal to Chavismo, who were penetrated by the Cubans, to get a transition in which a civilian Edmundo Gonzalez and Maria Corina Machado, not even in the country, would somehow have control of a group of this. That was not only going to take a big transition that involved a lot of risks, but potentially require U.S. boots on the ground, and indeed would likely lead to a really pre-planned and publicly announced sabotage campaign by those who didn't want to allow a government to come into power that could hold them legally accountable. Now, having said that, the question is, that basically just going to the number two, were there other options? Would there have been an option in which you did a transition to a democratic government? I remember back in the first Iraq War, the gratitude of the Kuwaitis after we liberated them, and thinking even today that the Venezuelans, who I think really have hungered for the elimination of this, and so certainly Maria Corina Machado, and especially has been very gracious of supporting President Trump and in his work in recognizing that importance. My sense is that there could have been a middle ground in which more support could have been provided, and the opportunity cost, I would say, that was lost here, in my judgment, would have been a democratic government, heartfelt thanking the United States, rejoicing Venezuelans throughout the region, a clear U.S. message, a clear government that was looking to, expunge Chinese, Cuban, Russian, and other, influence and work closely with the United States. I mean, I remember even something as small as when I was at the State Department back in 2019, 2020. And we facilitated a political transition to the PPP government in Guyana, who previously had a background in seeing the U.S. as a hostile actor based on our history with their party founder Chetty Jagan, and the goodwill that bought us with the PPP and the way that transformed Guyana into a partner in a strategic space in the region was difficult to put into words. And so, I think a lot of people will be playing armchair quarterback on this and what could or could not have been done. But I think as we move forward, what becomes vital is that there is not the perception in the region that this is just about U.S. oil and that the U.S. is indifferent in working with dictators and criminals versus working with Democrats. I think at least in the long term, as Secretary Rubio has pledged the U.S. To fully win this, we have to go beyond the oil and working with Delcy Rodriguez and show that we actually, whether it's slow motion, long term, or otherwise, bring back a legitimate democratic government, because that is the U.S. standing for democracy, rule of law, and institutions. For me, is one of the discriminators in our influence and fundamental to it as we compete against actors like China and Russia and others in the region. So I think it was prudent what the administration did, but I think eventually it's absolutely vital strategically for us, and in my opinion, for us to get there.
So a couple of times you've mentioned Cuba. We got a flood of questions on Cuba. So let's talk about it. So the Cubans have a number of people working in Venezuela, security people and military people. If our ultimate goal is a free Venezuela, and that might lead to a free Cuba, one might hope, is there any way in the interim to get the current Venezuelan government to remove the Cubans, to take them out of key roles, to point out to Cuba that this is not a long-term solution for them?
It's a great question. And I think part of it is that Delcy Rodriguez is in a very tricky place right now, in that, she has to think about internal rivals who will see their criminal and other interests threatened. And I mentioned before the ELN and certain FARC elements and certain military and other commanders and the sindicatos operating in the interior of the country, let alone her kind of political rivals within the upper echelons of Chavismo, like Pedrino Lopez, like Diosdado Cabello. And certainly as she thinks of, basically throwing the Cubans under the bus, she has to think of, whose interests are going to be threatened by that, and who might work to basically throw Delcy under the bus if she tries to do that. And so I think she's moving cautiously. But you also bring up a very important point, and indeed, I think Secretary Rubio has alluded to this. President Trump has alluded to this. Certainly, Cuba has been one of the, if not, the source of, counterinsurgency modeling, ideological guidance, other bad acting, and has been largely maintained by Venezuelan oil. It's been a month now since, thanks to President Trump's decision, there was, a shipment of Venezuelan oil or a shipment of Russian oil, though Mexico has sent some. My sense is that Cuba itself is, in a delicate situation, but we're going to see, to me, what Cubans call the special period from 1991 to 1995, the Cubans muddled through because of party control, not because people are enamored with the Cuban government, but I think their instruments of control are sufficiently embedded. And I fear that with a substantial amount of outmigration, literally since the COVID period, something like 2 million Cubans have already, it's estimated, left. And I suspect that more are going to leave as things get worse with those increasing pressures, with the blackouts, because Cuban system, after all, depends on, petroleum to produce oil, or to produce, electricity, and to keep the economy running. So I think the U.S. may have some opportunities it's going to be, I think we can certainly pressure Delcy without going too far to kick the Cubans out. I think she is going to probably hedge on that. And so we're going to have to probably manage that very closely. But I think also we can put pressure on the Cuban government, if they want to survive in the near term. What type of concessions do we expect of them? What type of cooperation do we expect with them? And frankly, also more broadly in the region. But I think it's really recognizing the complexity and putting pressure on all of those essentially leverage points simultaneously as we move forward, in my opinion.
So, two things jumped out at me as you were speaking. The first is that 2 million Cubans have left. Is that serious?
Yeah,
How many are there?
well, the interesting thing, Cuba has a population of approximately 8 million. It's been established that since 2019, that the Cuban population has decreased, according to their numbers, by 2 million. Approximately 1 million are actually documented as having left. So the question is, what happened to the other million people? Was that just, population decline and low birth rates? And so I think that the sense is that the actual number of Cubans who have left is at least 1.5 million. And there are some other effects in there, but certainly when when you lose a quarter of your population in 4 to 5 years, I mean, it shows that there is an economic disaster, and just an unsustainable situation.
So you add that to the 8 million Venezuelans or so who have left. I mean, they're depopulating themselves. But the other thing that you mentioned was that Cuba has received oil from Mexico,
Yes.
which raises the question of the next two neighbors over on the other side, Colombia and Mexico. I know that the president has spoken with Claudia Sheinbaum, and he has spoken to the president of Colombia, who I think is coming to visit at some point. Um, what is she thinking? We've cut off the oil to Cuba, and she says, okay, fine, I'll do it. This is
It's a,
not going
it's
to
a great
endear her to the president.
It's a great question. I think Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico is dancing a delicate dance. Probably the biggest point of leverage that the U.S. has over Mexico is the fact that 80 to 90% of Mexican exports go to the United States, and you can't replace that with China or other sources of investment, even though Sheinbaum is doing so kind of at the margins. In addition to that, there's the leverage of the renegotiation of the U.S.-Mexico trade agreement, USMCA. I think that there's an understanding by Scheinbaum that if USMCA is not successfully renegotiated, the economic as well as political effects of de-anchoring Mexico from the North American economy would be catastrophic. And so I think in many different areas, whether it's imposing 50% duties on some Chinese products or doing more aggressive cooperation on security. Mexico actually is very cooperative with respect to doing coordinated patrols on the U.S. southern border, although that's not widely known. And actually, I just came from an event involving U.S. Fifth Army or U.S. Army North, and frankly, the cooperation when you get past the politics is excellent between our two countries, albeit with distrust. But you're right that within Mexico's kind of traditional leftist politics, we can remember that Mexico during the negotiations with the rebels that used to fight against the government in El Salvador, that Mexico played a role in brokering talks in that civil war. So Mexico has always kind of fashioned itself, at least on the left, of having this kind of special independent role. And so this idea that Mexico will, sell oil and maintain its special relations with the Cuban, and frankly, Claudia Sheinbaum herself, she has had ties with the M19 guerrillas in Colombia. She played a role in Mexico City in basically giving employment as well as shelter to some of the most corrupt leftist members of Rafael Correa's former government in Ecuador. And so my sense is that she is trying to play her traditional politics as far as she can until she runs into a lot of pushback from the U.S. My understanding is in the first round, she told President Trump, at least what I saw publicly of this, that Mexico would had sovereign rights to its oil and it would sell to who it wanted. It was only an 85,000 barrel tanker, so it was a pretty small shipment. But I think the question is, how far does Secretary Rubio and President President Trump want to push her on this. I think at the end of the day, if push comes to shove, Mexico would shut off that oil, and it's not that much anyway. But I think right now Mexico is trying to walk that delicate dance, do the things that its leftist orientation of Moreno has always led it to do until it comes up against strong pushback from the U.S.
So everybody is doing the dance, right? The Venezuelans are doing the dance. They want to figure out how to deal with us. Mexico's doing it. Colombia. Where's Colombia? Are they doing
Colombia
it?
also. So, to me, one of the things that's been dependable over recent years is, of course, Gustavo Petro's imprudence. And I think Petro's career, even if one goes all the way back to his disastrous time as mayor of Bogota, has always been much better at talking the talk than actually implementing policies. And I think currently, if you look at his disastrous policies, in not going after cocoa production, which has literally increased by about 60% in the past year alone, his disastrous total peace policies, and the extension of those kind of the eloquent rhetoric, the nationalist indignation, is that every time that he's said something against President Trump in one way or another, there's been a lot of pushback. And so, of course, the most recent round of that was him apparently not being able to help himself, to talking about how just barbaric and unacceptable it was, what we had done, which of course had led President Trump to suggest that Petro could be next. And having seen 20 plus years of very close U.S. Colombian security coordination, many of our Mexican or Colombian military counterparts are just apoplectic. They understand where the U.S. is coming from because they've seen Petro's disastrous policies, but also the idea of finding themselves on the other side of U.S. arms, I think is shocking. Probably at the end of the day, my sense is that Petro realized that he had crossed a line. He had a very kind of self-effacing, apologetic call. There are some rumors that maybe even some New York Times reporters were brought in to listen in to Petro groveling about how bad Nicolás Maduro actually was. But at the end of the day, I think Petro was able to diffuse that situation and has taken it down a notch, if you will. My sense is that there's an understanding that U.S. military action against Colombia would probably be counterproductive. The real key things right now are Colombia's legislative elections in March, and more importantly, its presidential elections in May, I believe May 31st, in which right now a very pro-Trump, pro-U.S. right of center candidate, a lawyer, is leading in the polls, followed, of course, by the leftist candidate, Ivan Cepeda, with Petro's Pacto Histórico. But then the candidates that come after that, one is a centrist, the former Medellin Mayor Sergio Fajardo, and then after that, two other right of center candidates. And so at the end of the day, even if Colombia's election in May goes to a round two, it's looking pretty good for the right and a return to maybe a more cooperative posture. So my sense is that Petro has been talked off the cliff he put himself in, but the real strategic play here is what happens in the May elections. How does the U.S. maintain pressure but try to guide Colombia to a position where you possibly have a government that is more disposed to do policies on drugs and security cooperation that are, I should say, less counterproductive to U.S. and Colombia's own interests?
Do we trust Colombian elections? I mean, seriously. Not everybody has fair elections. When we look at the upcoming Colombia elections, we can like some candidates better than others and whatever. Can they hold fair elections?
No elections in really any place are completely fair, but
including ours.
including ours.
So.
But I would say there's a continuum. I mean, if you looked at Venezuelan elections where there was so much control, where literally, Nicolás Maduro could lose by a margin of 2-1, and then just declare himself a victor and say, "What are you going to do about it?" I think if you look at other places, for example, in Honduras, there was a lot of pressure with their electoral vehicle that there was to try to do a recount, some dirty tricks. Of course, the U.S. came in and pushed very hard to ensure that the actual right candidate, Nasri Esfura, was actually recognized as the winner. My sense is in Colombia, there is imperfections in systems. There is, but honestly, Colombia, despite corruption in a number of different institutions, has relatively functional institutions. The Colombians pride themselves on their laws and their legal systems, even despite its corruptions and inefficiency. And I would say their electoral system. In my sense, also is there's the advantage in Colombia that perhaps because of the own inability and paralysis and dysfunctionality of the Colombian left and Pacto Histórico, that despite Petro's ambitions maybe to be perpetual dictator, that he never had the opportunity to kind of entrench Pacto Histórico in controlling Colombian institutions in the way that some other leftist populists did. And so, and frankly, the Colombian right, I think, has long had a deep control and influence in Colombian institutions. And so my sense is there will probably be a lot of questions and back and forth, both in terms of violence in the countryside and with candidates and questions at the polls. But at the end of the day, if the right or center right legitimately wins the Colombian elections, I don't think Pacto Histórico is going to be in a position to stop them, is my sense.
It's interesting. The whole thing raises a question, and I said this in my opening, but I really want to know what you think. Is the Monroe Doctrine really still part of our internal thinking? Not that people say, yes, here's my bit of the Monroe Doctrine, but what happens in Central America also, but South America is very, very important to us. How much do you think we're willing to put into it? Obviously, President Trump was willing to put in enough to go catch Maduro.
That's a great question. And something that you said, I think, is very important, which is that even if we don't always act like it, the Latin America and the Caribbean is always vitally important to us. And we keep being reminded of that, the way in which it's really, there's no other part of the world that is directly connected to our economic prosperity through supply chains, through trade ties, as well as our physical security, whether it's immigration flows or organized crime or other things. And so understanding that dependency and the irony when we talk about Monroe Doctrine is not so much of how the region affects us, but number one, what is the U.S. concept of response? And I would mention the irony of the 1823 Monroe Doctrine you alluded to versus the Roosevelt corollary, which came at the turn of the century. And specifically, if you recall, the Monroe Doctrine was actually a newly independent United States who had just 9 years earlier fought its former colonizer, the British, to a standstill, had our own capital burned, and was looking around at what other European bad actors were doing in other parts of Latin America. Spain was trying to reconquer different parts of what had previously been its colonies. Russia was mucking around in the U.S. Pacific Northeast. And so in many ways, the Monroe Doctrine was actually us standing up and saying, we newly independent residents of the Americas, we have a shared stake in what happens here. So we're going to stand together against these extra hemispheric meddlers. Now, one could argue that with our hubris and power, by the time we got to Teddy Roosevelt and the Roosevelt corollary, it became a little bit more the U.S. using its power to impose its will for good or bad. But what I would say now is with the new U.S. national security strategy, clearly there's an indication that we recognize that centrality of the hemisphere, that what happens here affects us, and that we're going to concentrate on the hemisphere much more than we've concentrated in other places. There's clearly a recognition that we're going to push back against China's military presence as well as its broader influence. We use the term influence, that we're going to redeploy at least part of the military. And so that, it's not to say that the forward carrier battle group is going to be there in the Caribbean forever, but the possibility of having at least one carrier battle group, maybe one amphibious ready group, the ARG that's there with its embarked 22nd Marine Expeditionary Unit. It's not unrealistic to think that you're not going to have a lot more forces to do drug interdiction, to do migration, to do other things than we've previously seen. So I think the military resources are there. I think the attention is there. I think certainly this administration, not only with President Trump, but people like Marco Rubio, the commitment is there. I think what remains to be seen is how effective the policies will be, because the real difficult part of the challenge for me is not the success successes we've had thus far in the military operation, but to what degree can we compete against the insidious offer of China through access to their markets, through the deals that if you only talk nice to China and advocate for them, you can get a Chinese company as your business partner, and then we'll all get rich, whatever the gringos are saying. And so I think, to me, the real challenge is to what degree can we translate the demonstrated capability to act decisively to really rebuilding a collective sphere of security and prosperity based in rule of law and democracy. So for me, that is strategically what's required for this to be sustainable and to compete effectively against the Chinese. And so how we get to that point, I think, is the question that is playing out right now for me.
Okay, let's move it back into Venezuela. One of the things that impacts our security is the fact that Venezuela has not had visa requirements for people from Iran and Hezbollah and other, you know, what should we call them? Unpleasant people. From there, from Venezuela, they were able to move out. They came across our border. The border's closed. That's the good news. Border's basically closed. How do we get them to stop doing that and find out who those people are? It's one thing to say to Delcy Rodriguez, you have to behave a certain way, but a lot of these guys are already there. Now what?
So for me, one of the real good news stories, one of the things that may be one of the early wins that we can actually get in this very complex situation may be with respect to Iran and Hezbollah. So, as you know, in addition to Russia and China, Venezuela, as you pointed out, has long been the principal point of entry for Iran as well as Hezbollah in the region. However, what I would argue is that, especially now, if there's the prospect of U.S. investment in the oil sector, Iran really contributed only at the margin. Iran was brought in, especially after roughly 2020, when the Iranian regime was under sanctions, trying to help to repair some of the Venezuelan refineries, provide diluent for Venezuela to get its oil out under a 2022 agreement, and then of course that broadened also, and the military cooperation deepened, the collaboration on drone assembly, the Mojaher 2 drone and the Mojaher 6 drone, which at least Iran provides to Venezuela, and then of course more broadly the arms sales of the fast attack boats, the Zulkafar boats with the modified Chinese missiles and other things that were used to threaten Guyana. And so you had those things at the margin, and of course the oil was paid for and those services were paid for, my understanding, by Venezuelan gold, which was laundered through different Middle Eastern actors such as Turkey with Erdogan. But my sense is that if you look at the actual value or contribution of what Venezuelan got, Delcy Rodriguez, I think, with enough in the right U.S. pressure, it's pretty. Iran is the one that it's logical to throw under the bus first in Hezbollah, and especially also useful to recognize that this may have been a luxury play, both economically and otherwise. Hugo Chavez initially was playing with Iranians in Hezbollah as a type of kind of revolutionary solidarity, and then of course it became a business deal with the previous Venezuelan actor Tariq al-Assami, who used his Lebanese Syrian network also to make a lot of money off of Hezbollah dealings. And then, of course, we saw the Iranians coming in with Mohsin Rabbani when he was administering the madrasas in Qum and recruiting Venezuelans to come to the madrasas, as well as sending Venezuelan radical clerics and others into the region with Venezuelan passports. And then, of course, the whole question of the Iranian Quds forces, the Iranian state forces, who were being given mobility initially by Convias Airline, but then through Mahan Air, which was reflagged as M. Trasur, moving around the region. So I think a lot of those things are, I would say, things that a this bad actor regime did because nobody was there to stop them and they were making some money off on the side. But my sense is that those are the types of things that with the right U.S. pressure, and especially with a weakened Hezbollah after Israeli operations against Hezbollah leadership in Lebanon, and certainly right now with U.S. pressure and Israeli pressure against Iran, that Iran really isn't in a position to do much for Delcy Rodriguez, nor is Hezbollah. And so this is probably a real opportunity to shut that door. And I would hope and I would assume that many knowledgeable people I know, ironically, one of the people who is the U.S. Deputy Secretary of Defense for in Secretary Hegseth's office, Joseph Humeyer, is actually one of the most knowledgeable people on Iran and Hezbollah in Venezuela, in Latin America. So I think there are people within the Trump administration who understand this danger and who probably understand that this is maybe one success story where we can help close that door if we do it right as part of our dealings with Delcy and the others.
Interesting. We got a question here, and I totally skipped my mind. Tell us, if you can, about Maduro's wife. We arrested both of them. It's not like, we left her home with the kids. What is she charged with, and why did we take her?
It's a great question. I mean, in my understanding, Cilia Flores is also charged with a number of different narco trafficking charges. It is contained in that unsealed indictment that was released, I think, literally the day that we went after them. It had been held literally since 2019, 2020. It was interesting because, again, when I was at State, we knew about all these things and we knew what we knew, and we could kind of talk about it obliquely. But it's kind of neat to see the indictment finally getting unsealed to show just the number of different narco trafficking things. And of course, it wasn't just them. It was actually, her, I believe, nephews, including who were arrested in Haiti for literally direct narco trafficking operations. And so there are a lot of direct narco trafficking connections. Obviously, she was part of the network, not as directly connected as Maduro, but clearly she was part of the narco trafficking operations and the influence operations. And so, and as such, probably like Maduro, will stand trial very publicly, probably in a New York court, if not a Miami court. Again, if found guilty, which I think, given the severity of the charges that I've seen and the evidence I have to presume we have, will probably be, along with Maduro, locked up for a very long time.
The form of equality for women that I'm not crazy about. Okay, another question. How many U.S. citizens, or do we know, could be in Venezuelan jails at the moment? And do you think we can get them?
It's a great question. I'm not sure of the actual number, and of course, you have the question of U.S. AMSITs who may also have Venezuelan ties or identity. I think the actual number of U.S. citizens may be in the kind of the 10 to 20 range, but I have not seen a concrete figure. We know that there are approximately 800 or more political prisoners, including something like 40 or 50 party leaders, as well as I think 40 or 50 reporters, but certainly there are a number of U.S. citizens. I've heard that as many as between 60 and maybe as high as 200 have now been released out of those 800. I don't know the specific cases of the AMSITs, but I have to assume that those are high on the list. And of course, previously they played this round robin game where we'd negotiate for a few and they'd release a few, usually coming over to visit Venezuelan significant others, or and then they'd grab a few more on other trumped up charges and saying it was espionage. So my guess is that the things have now stopped. Probably if there are any left, they have been released or are being released, and I have to assume that at least for the moment, new U.S. Citizens, I would like to believe, are not being picked up as Maduro did, but. I would mention that there is a concerted effort by the Delcy Rodriguez administration, even as they're cooperating with us, to try to go after, through Sabine and others, and round up the people that were seen as cooperating with the Americans, and that might put other AMSITs at risk. And so it's still complicated, but I think it's definitely gotten a lot better for AMSITs and political prisoners now than it was before we took Maduro.
So again, yet again, you've raised the next question for me. Um, presumably, excuse me, presumably we had lots of inside help inside of Venezuela to do this because you can't do it without. So now Maduro is here. There have been reports that he is collaborating with the Americans and giving them information in order to maximize his own position. Is it your view that he is cooperating? And what do you think we want from him right now to make things better for us?
Well, and I'll tell you, I do not have specific information about what's happening in those conversations with DOJ or whoever else is, interrogating him. And it actually was interesting that I believe he made a brief stop in Guantanamo before he was taken, to the U.S. for his arraignment. I think most people that know Maduro, and these are just more, what in Latin America we would call chisme, conversations, that I've had with some of my Venezuelan colleagues. Nobody who knows Maduro thinks that he is going to, hold out for his dignity or to protect his fellow Chavistas. And so I think there's a general assumption that he's singing like a bird, just like, so many of the others who were taken into custody over the years probably were. And so the presumption is that all of that information, he certainly didn't have information about everyone's, different things at all levels. But I'm sure there's a lot of information about the different criminal rackets and who is doing what with Cartel de los Soles and where some of the bank accounts are. I mean, the conversation, about Delcy Rodriguez is, saying, well, Delcy, yeah, we're having an interesting talk with the Qatari government about your bank accounts in Qatar as you decide how much you want to cooperate with us. And so I think the fact that even whether Maduro is actually talking or not, and I would be surprised if he wasn't. I think everyone, as they negotiate with the U.S., has to presume that he is talking and is probably making some of their decisions based on that. So I think we're probably in a very fruitful period where everyone is doing their best to sell everyone else out right now. And the net beneficiary of that is probably our Justice Department and intelligence.
It'd be interesting to see where that goes. Question from a listener. Do you think that Venezuelans in the United States will start to go back?
Great question. I would say only in very small numbers. There was certainly celebration in the street, just in the same way that when Fidel Castro, so many years ago, died in Cuba, people celebrated before realizing that, with Raul Castro and then with Miguel Diaz-Canel, there wasn't going to be any real change. So my sense is that because there's been and will continue to be a marginal economic opening. The lifting of sanctions, some oil companies coming back in, things like American Airlines reopening flights, that there will be enough opening of economic activity that people who have been yearning to go back, some will go back. But there's an understanding their intelligence services, Sabine, still is there. They're still rounding up Venezuelans. I have friends who, have been waiting, to see whether loved ones would be released from the El Coide or wherever else they're being held. And so there are many, many who understand that they're still keeping these prisoners. This is still the same repressive regime. There are still charges against many of the people, for being anti-regime figures who thus don't dare to go back. And frankly, I think until there's a sense that there really is a legitimate democratic opening, I think that the vast majority of Venezuelans, if they have something sustainable someplace else, will stay away. I think if you really do get to that promised phase three, where you have an elected government, I think that's when you see the real kind of exuberance and hope and many coming back. In some ways, however, it's a bit of a blessing because, frankly, the Venezuelan infrastructure and the economy isn't ready for the return of 9 million Venezuelans right now. So, although it's a disappointment, a gradual return may not entirely be a bad thing for Venezuelan stability.
Okay, so, we're getting close to the end of the program. And I was just going to try to keep moving toward optimistic kinds of things. But then somebody reminded me that we have not mentioned Tren de Aragua, and I can't say it, but you can say it. Is it really an arm of the Venezuelan government? Is it really something that the government can put out of business if it chooses to? That's what we were saying. That's what our government was saying about Maduro himself, that he is a narco-terrorist because it is his organization. Is it his organization?
Yes and no. I think it's important not to miss the forest for the trees. So for example, Tren de Aragua basically is one of multiple different criminal gangs. And in this particular case, they came to have control over a neglected prison, and then as their people got out, their racket was the exploitation through human trafficking of Venezuelans. And so what happened is that as the Venezuelans desperately went into Colombia, many without resources, then went to places like Peru and even Chile, and then eventually to the United States. Over 1 million, of course, coming to U.S. cities. It wasn't that the Venezuelans necessarily were bad, but these were some really bad people that were exploiting desperate Venezuelans. It's like, okay, if you want to eat, if you want a place to stay, if you want money for transportation, we're going to exploit you into prostitution and other things, and then violently taking over territory. Now, my understanding is that Tren de Aragua itself has actually fractionalized. There actually was a clampdown on that actual prison, and so to some degree, Maduro would say, well, it was controlled. Well, they were never really put out of business, but there are copycat gangs. Part of Tren de Aragua still exists. Yes, they are still a terrorist organization, probably as a factor in U.S. cities with our control over the border with President Trump's administration. That has their footprint has dramatically been reduced, although there's still a factor in Lima, in Bogota, in certain other places. But were they tied to the Maduro administration? Probably in some ways. There was a military officer, a Venezuelan officer, who was actually murdered by Tren de Aragua representatives in Chile a couple months ago. So it's clear that the Venezuelans probably worked through Tren de Aragua, but without saying that this was actually an arm of the Venezuelan government. But probably even more broadly than Tren de Aragua, when we talk about Cartel de las Solas, again, it was Solas because the Venezuelan generals have basically sons as on their epaulets, indicating that they are general officers. So basically, since Hugo Chavez, they set up Venezuela as a criminal franchise operation. And so if you controlled a military district, a Zodi already, you profited on, you got a cut of the smuggling of people who had to pay if they wanted to get the remittances in through their family. You got a cut of the gasoline smuggling. You got a cut of the narco trafficking and the narco labs if it was in your territory. You got a cut, and that flowed all the way up to the top. And what we saw, again, we talked about the Cilia Flores and the famous narco nephews, as well as Maduro, Pedrino Lopez. They were all getting cuts. They all were making criminal rackets. I mean, Nicolás Maduro himself. They have found cars and Lamborghinis and all kinds of just crazy things and properties. And so everyone was getting rich off this. Again, it was a criminal franchise scheme in which everybody passed a cut up to the top. Now, does that, is it a hierarchical organization? Is it a collaborative organization? Who was calling the shots? Did it facilitate the flow of drugs, or did it enable the flow of drugs, or did it command the flow of drugs? I mean, the bottom line was the criminal networks through Tren de Aragua, through the others, through Carta de las Olas that existed, thanks to this, criminal, non-elected regime, prospered, and that caused damage and violence through migrant trafficking, through prostitution, through drugs in U.S. cities. But I think sometimes people want to fight over the nature of control or what the name of the organization is. But I think the bottom line, at the end of the day, the existence of this criminal cabal was what was responsible for crime and harm to Americans and the rest of the region. And we are now putting a stop to that. To me, that's kind of the center truth, kind of independent of the naming.
It makes sense. Okay, we're going to come to the end. We're going to go out on a positive note because that's my thing. We go out on a positive note. If you were looking and if you were asking the question, what does a good outcome look like in Venezuela? Clearly, it's not going to be perfect, at least for a while, because as you pointed out, we have still bad actors and all these other things. But what would you call success in Venezuela for the United States and also for the Venezuelan people?
It's a great question. And frankly, I would have to say the three elements of Secretary Rubio's transition plan, if they actually can be done successfully, the achievement of those three things really are the key to what you want. So, number one, stability, avoiding a situation where the country burns down in sabotage of the petroleum sector and in violence and in infighting and war between the ELN and et cetera, et cetera, that produces a mass outflow of migration and other problems and environmental catastrophe from burning oil fields. So stability and preserving that, whatever else you do, recovery, and so to reactivate the oil sector, and other things to bring the investment back. Maybe not of it's all, but bring some level of prosperity that creates the way for Venezuelans to come back, and then democracy. So at the end of the day, if you don't get to a government that the Venezuelan people believe is their democratically elected government and not a criminal franchise, then everything else, becomes the U.S. is looked at cynically. The Venezuelan people are disappointed. People don't come back to the country, and you have a something that was better than it was before, but still fundamentally unstable and dissatisfying. And you don't really get the other threat actors, China, Russia, Iran, Hezbollah, out of the country. And I think you need that, but the degree to which you get that depends on, especially you getting to that third key platform, which is the rule of law, democratic institutions. Now, people will argue which should have come before which. Should have you had democracy before stability and then prosperity, or so the way that President Trump has chosen to proceed isn't everyone's cup of tea, but I think you have to have those three things: stability, recovery, and democracy, and then by extension, that allows you to expel the Irans, the Hezbollahs, the Russians, the Cubans, and others that you need for real hemispheric security.
And crucially for Americans, all done without American boots on the ground.
Absolutely.
We don't want that.
Yes.
Okay. We're wrapping up. I want to say thank you. As you know, our focus tends to be the Middle East and the security issues that are there. But you can never forget that this is where we live. And you've done a fabulous job of bringing the issues of our hemisphere to our listeners. And I think it was fantastic. Evan Ellis, I thank you.
Well, thank you. A real pleasure doing this. And again, my thanks to the Jewish Policy Center and my thanks to the group, the audience, for their interest in this topic, and welcome the chance to continuing interacting and working with you in the organization.
Great. Thank you very much, everybody. We'll see you again.